The pendant caught the light like a small, stubborn truth. It was a coincidence of placement more than anything. Jasmine had been wiping a table near the window when a server brushed past her and the thin chain around her throat slipped, the tiny oval charm swinging free to kiss the sunlight. It was old, its gold dulled and its enamel chipped at one corner. Someone had once set a tiny, faded photograph beneath a glass face and sealed it with careful hands. Jasmine never wore it for show. It had belonged to her for as long as she could remember. A relic from a childhood stitched between foster homes, a talisman against the idea that she had no past worth carrying. At the head table, Margaret Lancaster shifted. The elegant silk of her sleeve made no sound, but something in the line of her hand went still. She had been a woman who learned to read a room in the span of a breath. Years of boardrooms and philanthropic galas had taught her that, and the glint from that pendant had a way of rearranging the air. Up close, it was the photograph beneath the glass that arrested her. A woman with a soft jawline, dark hair pulled back, the faint suggestion of the Lancaster profile that lived in family portraits in Margaret's private study. The pendant matched one that had been kept in a glass case on the family mantel for decades, a case Margaret had opened once, in private, on the morning she had buried hope. Her hands trembled so slightly she thought for a second it might be the service of age. Then the table's murmurs tightened. Someone said hello, someone laughed, the restaurant kept its civilized hush. Margaret rose with the slow, precise motion of someone used to standing and addressing a room. But she did not go to the podium. Instead, she walked, unannounced, through the hum of white tablecloths and the scent of lemon and roasted garlic. She stopped with a single, deliberate step at Jasmine's side. "Excuse me," she said, and the voice that belonged to a woman who had lectured boards into unanimity was quiet enough to be private. "May I?" Jasmine, in her fatigued uniform, turned. Her face was composed by habit, neutral, serviceable. She had learned to be small and steady in public. The pendant, cool against her collarbone, seemed suddenly heavier under the scrutiny of an authority she recognized only from society pages and the faint, distant presence of the name Lancaster. "Do you work here?" Margaret asked. Her eyes were not unkind, but they held a gravity that suggested she had gone to a funeral this morning and decided she would not go to another without answers. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Jasmine." Her name was automatic. She had said it 1,000 times as trays changed hands. She felt the pendant like a coin shifting. The photograph beneath its glass was tiny, but Margaret's gaze had narrowed as if mapping a face into memory. "You shouldn't keep something so personal out where it could be lost," Margaret murmured. Then she did something nobody expected. She put a gloved hand, gently, with a strange tenderness, under Jasmine's chin and tipped the pendant up so she could see it. Her fingers were steady as a surgeon's. They both looked at the picture. The woman in the pendant was young, pregnant in the slant of the cheek, and the likeness, manner of the mouth, the high arch of the brow, pressed like a claim on Margaret's chest. "Do you know where this came from?" Margaret asked. Jasmine blinked. The question arrived like an echo from a life she had tried to catalog in neat, forgettable boxes. "No, ma'am. My foster mom gave it to me when I left the group home." Margaret stepped back. The restaurant air seemed to compress. Around them, forks paused mid-air, but neither spoke for a beat that expanded and demanded decision. Margaret did not make the scene of a woman in an expensive coat recognizing a waitress's jewelry. She made the scene of someone who had spent a life unlearning denial. "We need to talk somewhere private," she said finally, "now." Jasmine went because she was curious, because the pendant had been with her through hospital rooms and transfer vans, because curiosity had kept her from sleeping through most of her 20s. She followed Margaret into the service elevator, the leather of the mat beneath her shoes whispering as if to remind her of the difference between the floor above and the floor below. Margaret's private booth was in the back, a small enclave softened by low light and the smell of rosemary. Her face, as she closed the velvet curtain behind them, carried an expression that felt to Jasmine like an accusation and an invitation wrapped in one. Margaret did not offer immediate explanations. She reached into her clutch and produced a slim black card. "My name is Margaret Lancaster," she said. "I am likely the last person you expected to know of you, but this," she tapped the pendant gently, "belongs to my family. It belonged to my daughter." Jasmine's throat tightened in a way that had little to do with surprise. The name daughter had hung in her life like a rumor. She had a birth certificate with one line of information and a dozen gaps the size of rooms. She had been the child who learned to explain herself in half-truths and to soothe others with a joke. "I don't," she began. She had rehearsed versions of this moment in the quiet hours. A woman in a newspaper recognizing something, a phone call, a DNA test, a life upending like a table. The rehearsed version had never felt as raw as this living, breathing presence opposite her. Margaret reached for her handbag again, but this time she drew out a photograph, marked at the edges by years, and slid it across the table. The woman in the photograph was the same as the pendant, only larger, only clearer. There was a hospital bracelet looped around her wrist in the photo, and eyes that looked tired in a way that felt like a story begun with scarcity and ended with silence. "You were born on March 15th, Margaret said, at Newark General. The records show a birth in the early morning, a girl listed as Mother Unknown. She disappeared from the ward before she could be named. We believed what we were told, that she had been taken to another city, that an adoption had happened under legal counsel's supervision. We looked, we searched. There were explanations, medical errors, paperwork lost. It has been 32 years. This pendant was all I had left." Jasmine felt everything contract and then expand outward in an ache that was part grief, part a long-dormant recognition. March 15th had been a date she had never connected to anything more than a number scribbled in a file folder she kept in the bottom drawer of a dresser, a folder of closed papers and blurred signatures. The idea that the pendant linked her, somehow, impossibly, to the Lancaster family was an orbit shift. I don't remember Newark," she said. "I was in the system, foster care. I know my file says foundling and—" Margaret held up a hand. "It doesn't matter now how it unfolded. You have this pendant. It matches the one in our home. I want to confirm, privately if we can. We will arrange a DNA test. If it's you, if you are who I think you are, you will know that we have spent a lifetime asking where you went." The word confirm fell like a hinge. Jasmine's survival had been built on guarded decisions. A DNA test was a promise to open an old wound. She hesitated, feeling the faces of every social worker she had ever met forming a crowd in her mind. But Margaret's hand, now steady, offered no command, only an offer. "If you want privacy, you will have it," she said. "If you prefer the opposite, you will have that too. But I ask, will you let me help you find the truth?" Jasmine considered her paycheck and the nights in rooms that smelled like old pizza and antiseptic. She thought of the small, brittle rituals of adulthood she'd built, her savings account, the way she counted rent due, and realized that ignorance had been both a shield and a trap. She slid the pendant back to its chain, fingers clumsy but decisive. "Yes," she said, "we'll do it." Margaret did not waste time. That evening, a discreet call set in motion a sequence of private tests and sealed rooms. She was a woman who knew how to marshal resources quietly. Over the next 48 hours, Jasmine walked through a corridor of professionals who spoke in soft certainties and matter-of-fact sentences. A hospital lab technician took a cheek swab in a curtained room that smelled faintly of disinfectant and lemon polish. A DNA analyst promised expedited processing. Margaret's lawyer, A compact man named Hargrove, with wire-rimmed glasses, explained the steps in a tone that did not invite argument. Chain of custody, custody of the sample, a hold on media contact. "We will keep it within this circle until we know," he assured Jasmine. "If you want to invite anyone else at any point, it's your decision." The results came back before the weekend. Margaret received them in the hush of her penthouse study, where light fell across framed degrees and photographs that still bore the shape of a life paused. She did not open the envelope alone. She had told no one. She wanted no leaks, no press cycles fueled by rumor. She wanted truth. When Hargrove placed the report on her desk and folded his hands, Margaret felt the old ache gather at the base of her throat. The thin, constant pressure of someone who had been given responsibility for both a family and its secrets. The printed analysis carried a sentence so precise it felt obscene. The probability of relatedness was overwhelmingly consistent with first-degree kinship. The lab's confidence was expressed in numbers and scientific terms that Margaret's heart read as a single sentence. She had a granddaughter. She did not exhale. Instead, she dialed one number with fingers that had guided acquisitions and board votes for decades. She asked for contact information for the state's cold case unit and for the district attorney's office. She instructed Hargrove to prepare a legal path, to secure hospital records, to request forensic review of archival birth logs, to issue subpoenas where necessary. Her job had always been to translate pain into action. Now she mustered that skill for herself. When she left the penthouse to find Jasmine at the restaurant an hour later, she did not carry flowers. She carried a folder and a resolve that made the air around her lean forward. Jasmine sat at the private table, heartbeat even but adrenaline tight along her arms. She had expected relief or collapse. Instead, she felt like someone who had been waiting for permission to step into a new role. Margaret slid into the seat opposite, as if she had always belonged there. She placed the folder on the table. "When the lab called," Margaret said, "they phrased it clinically. But I will say this plainly. You are my granddaughter. I am going to do everything in my power to find out what happened that night. If you want to do this publicly, we will prepare for the attention. If you want privacy while we do the work." "I want to know what happened," Jasmine said simply. "Everything. But I also don't want to have my life pulled apart on camera. I don't have parties or money. I have shifts and nights I can't miss. If there's a way to do this without being a spectacle, I'd like that." Margaret nodded. "We will respect your boundaries, but understand, some truths demand daylight. If there was wrongdoing, it should be exposed." "Not for revenge," her voice tightened, "but for accountability, and to make sure no other child disappears because the system allowed it." Jasmine swallowed. The words accountability and system had reverberations she felt in the hollow of her ribs. She had seen foster homes that were patchwork and patchy care, that sometimes felt less like safety than the postponement of harm. "Who will look into it?" Jasmine asked. Margaret named names. A retired investigator she trusted. A young, tenacious assistant U.S. attorney who owed her nothing but had a moral compass she respected. She spoke in the efficient, organized cadence of someone turning grief into procedure. Jasmine listened to the litany of people and appointments and felt an odd mixture of fear and relief. At the same time, beneath it all, there was a whisper of recognition that perhaps someone in a position of power could be trusted to bend the machinery toward justice. The first discoveries were bureaucratic in nature, and therefore, to Jasmine, no less momentous. A misfiled nurse's log from March 15th. A thin strip of paper brittle with age. An invoice for transportation tagged to a private nursing agency. Signatures that didn't match hospital staff rosters. Margaret watched it all with the slow ferocity of someone who had been taught not to flinch from hard truths. She insisted, gently but firmly, that Jasmine be present at every step. "You're the one with the right to tell us when it goes too far," she told Jasmine. "No one will speak for you without your permission." The retired investigator, a compact woman named Pilar, with a voice that remembered storms, went deeper. She sat with Jasmine for hours in a small office, going through files, names, and timelines. Jasmine told Pilar what she remembered: fragmented images of a hospital room smell, a woman humming to herself, a name on a folded paper. And Pilar pressed the gaps into questions like a cartographer mapping a coastline. It was Pilar who noticed a pattern in a tangle of signatures. Victoria Hargreaves, the name that surfaced again and again in old hospital ledgers and charitable donation lists, appeared in places where her presence should have been improbable. Victoria had been a prominent philanthropy board member and a social operator who navigated hospital networks with ease. Officially, she had been involved in coordinating adoptions and fundraisers. Unofficially, rumors in old local papers hinted at business dealings threaded with ambition. Victoria had been dead for nearly 10 years, but her shadow remained in addresses and account numbers. People confided in her, Pilar said. She had access, and she managed to turn access into influence. Sometimes that's benign, sometimes it's not. The influence pattern Pilar traced led to a bank account tied to a shell company. Small deposits, then larger payouts, then silence. The money trail curved toward a name known in corporate circles as a fixer, a former partner of Victoria's who had once been on the Lancaster board. His company had grown dramatically in the years following the disappearance, acquiring properties that had once been part of the Lancaster estate. The more Pilar pulled, the more the pattern suggested opportunism. Remove one child from a family, destabilize the heirs, and assets become easier to consolidate. There was, too, the more intimate thread: Robert. He was no caricature of villainy. He had misplaced his moral compass in the way desperate people do. Crushing debts, a fear of prison, a whispered offer folded into a night shift. He had been the nurse on duty that early March morning, a man whose hands had steadied more than his life. Pilar found his signature in the ledger of transfers and found, tucked in an HR file, a resignation letter that read like an apology and a note that, until then, had been overlooked. When Pilar confronted him, he did not deny the shape of his actions. He sat with his shoulders slumped in a small room that smelled of coffee and old paper. The years had taken color from him. His teeth had that tired, habitual look of someone who had not slept well in a long time. "I was scared," he said, voice thin. "There were people I owed. They said, if I helped, if I let a baby go, they'd pay for my trouble. They promised they'd take care of it. They told me the paperwork would make it legal. I kept telling myself I was doing the right thing in the wrong way. I told myself it would stop hurting everyone, but it never stopped hurting me." His confession carried the weight the ledger had only hinted at. Someone had paid to have a child removed from the ward, and those funds had circulated in ways that suggested not just a single self-preserving act, but a network of convenience and avarice. The conspirators had used the disappearance as cover, and in the years that followed, the vacancy had been harnessed toward gain. Jasmine listened to Robert's words and felt a catalogue of small deaths ripple through her: the loss of a name, the theft of possibilities. At the same time, she felt no human impulse toward a simple vengeance. Her anger was not the kind that boiled into spectacle. It shaped itself into a patient and cold clarity. She wanted the record set straight, the people who had profited to be held to account, and a mechanism to make certain no one else could be made to vanish into paperwork. News, inevitably, found the edges of privacy. Margaret had hoped to contain the discovery and the initial investigations, but the world leaned toward stories about money, loss, and reconciliation. An anonymous tip, a photograph of the pendant sent to a local column, and a whispered thread online expanded the circle faster than any one person could control. Within days, a reporter looking for the human heart of the story located Jasmine. She was careful in the interviews she granted. Short statements, rehearsed facts, an insistence that the search was ongoing and that she would speak more fully when she felt she could. The public response split along predictable lines. those who saw a fairy tale reunion of lost heirs and wealthy beneficiaries, those who smelled a scandal, and those who recognized, from experience, the thinness of sensational headlines. For Jasmine, the glare was a new wilderness. There were days she could not sleep because an image of herself, youthful and uncertain, might appear next to a headline she did not control. There were other days when letters arrived, notes from people who remembered similar gaps in their families, bargains struck in the dark, or simply people who offered a meal or a place to stay. The kindness made up, in imperfect measure, for the curiosity. Margaret's first real public act was measured. She arranged a press release that acknowledged the DNA confirmation but asked for time to investigate the historical record. "There will be no rush to judgment," the statement read. "There will be a careful review of records and a determination of our next steps." For many, the measured voice was maddening, a hedge against appetite for justice. For Margaret, it was essential. She had seen too many causes derail when thunderous noise outpaced concrete evidence. Inside the investigations, Pilar and the DA began to stitch together a prosecutorial strategy. The challenge was complex: statutes of limitations, death of key figures, faded records. Yet the ledger and Robert's admission offered a thin but crucial seam. There was also the corporate angle, the pattern of asset consolidation that had enriched people who, for years, quietly benefited from the administrative chaos that followed a missing heir. The first legal move was a subpoena for hospital records and the freeze of certain accounts linked to transfers from the shell company. Margaret and her attorney navigated the public relations with an eye to preserving Jasmine's autonomy. "We will pursue this as long as it takes," Hargrove said in an early meeting, "but understand there will be delays. The law is slow, and those who once benefited from ambiguity will fight to keep their gains. You must be prepared." Jasmine nodded, and the nod was both an acceptance and a small challenge, to herself, to the idea of enduring a long, messy fight. She had survived bureaucracies that moved slowly. Perhaps this would be no different. Yet as they filed subpoenas and issued requests for archived footage and correspondence, a different feeling took root, a sense that she was no longer simply the subject of someone else's past, but an agent in her own rescue. There was a moment, weeks later, that felt like an exhale. It occurred in a narrow records room at Newark General, under the hum of fluorescent lights and the soft rustle of paper. A volunteer archivist named Thomas, who had worked to preserve the hospital's history, handed Pilar a thin bundle wrapped with a ribbon gone gray at the edges. Inside were scanned transfer slips, nursing rosters, and an old handwritten ledger in which someone had crossed out names in hurried blue ink. Among the papers was a photograph clipped from a hospital newsletter. Victoria Hargraves, smiling in a nurse's visiting room during a fundraiser. The photograph bore, in the margin, a note in a hurried hand. "Assisted, no payment recorded, V." The note looked innocuous until Pilar saw the pattern. The initial appeared on other pages where transfers had been signed by nurses whose names later were crossed out and replaced by different registrars. The ledger suggested a small machinery of erasure and substitution, the kind that happens when systems are exploited by those with influence and inside help. Pilar took the documents to Hargrove and the DA, who, in turn, requested a forensic audit of the accounts. The first set of subpoenas for financial records revealed transfers into trusteeships and a quiet rerouting of funds into a company that, years later, had bid for Lancaster properties. The legal team's strategy solidified: prove the nexus between the hospital's internal manipulations and external financial benefit. At the same time, Robert's role became a moral focal point. He offered to testify in exchange for a degree of clemency, and his willingness to speak up opened doors to others who had been silence-bound by fear. The investigators uncovered a series of informal payments, cash exchanges and under-the-table arrangements that fed the broader plan. It was a small web, but the web connected to people who had climbed on its threads. News cycles sharpened. The city's tabloids ran with images of Margaret and Jasmine walking into a courthouse on a gray morning. Protesters gathered at hospital board meetings demanding transparency. Old philanthropic partners began to distance themselves as investigations widened. There was damage to reputations and, for some families, a rebirth of questions that had long seemed impossible to answer. Through it all, Jasmine held to a particular steadiness that surprised even those who knew her. She did not drown in the novelty of being a public figure. Rather, she used the attention to amplify a message she had only recently allowed herself to form: that the foster system was fragile, and children could fall through seams not because of malice alone, but because of the system's indifference to detail. "If this could happen to me," she told a small group at a community center one afternoon, "it could happen to anyone. We have to make sure people are watching in the right ways." Margaret watched Jasmine on that stage, her posture, the ease of her jokes that carried heavier truths, and felt a strange, aching pride. She remembered the mornings after the funeral when she had sat in the empty rooms of her house and wondered whether grief would calcify into bitterness. Now, grief had found a direction. She would use the power she had, the legal tools at her disposal, and not to reclaim what was lost for herself alone, but to reconstruct the scaffolding that would catch others. The first subpoenas were only the beginning. The real test would be in court, where proofs would meet old loyalties and buried deals. As the calendar marched toward a preliminary hearing, people who had once occupied rooms adjacent to power began to shift, aligning with one side or another. And in the quiet of her apartment, late one night, Jasmine found the pendant in her palm and turned the little photograph beneath its glass until the face of the woman, her mother by likeness, if not by memory, was clear. She thought of the laundry lists of her past and the possibility of remaking them into something forward-facing. She could not forget what had been taken, nor did she want to. The pendant had become a small, stubborn truth that she would carry into the hearings and beyond. Outside the courthouse steps, a man in a cheap suit with hands that betrayed his nights of worry watched Margaret walk up the marble and inhaled sharply as he recognized the face of the woman who had once given him promises he had not kept. He felt, for the first time in years, the specific weight of responsibility settle into his chest. It was a beginning, and everyone involved knew it. The ledger had been found, the payments had a trail, a nurse had confessed, and a granddaughter had been identified. But there were missing pages yet, witnesses who might fold, and a network of quiet influence that could unravel or tighten. As Margaret prepared her remarks to the DA, and Jasmine prepared to give a statement to community members, neither could imagine the specific reverberations that were about to spill into press rooms, into legal filings, and into the tender of reparative possibility. Pilar's phone buzzed at dawn, and when she read the message, she said nothing for a long time. The message was a single line: "Found the name in the trust ledger. It's not what we thought." She looked at the photograph of Jasmine propped on her desk, and then at the city waking beyond her window. The name on the ledger would change the prosecutorial approach if it belonged to the person she suspected, a former partner with the legal acumen to insulate his assets. Pilar straightened. She made a call to Hargrove and then to the DA. In the corridor outside, Jasmine tightened the clasp on her pendant, feeling for the small ridge where the glass met the metal, as if that tiny seam could hold together everything that had been severed. She did not know yet that, in a few days, an archive box would reveal a letter that shifted the axis of the whole case, that Robert's admissions would be tested under cross-examination, and that the concept of restitution would be redefined by a woman who had more money than sense for sentiment. She only knew this: the pendant had opened a door. What came next would be harsher and more luminous than any of them imagined. What came next would be harsher and more luminous than any of them imagined. The preliminary hearing began in a room where the light slanted through tall windows onto rows of folded papers and the careful faces of people who had learned to keep their feelings close. Reporters murmured like a distant tide. Cameras were set at angles that revealed just enough to make matters public without allowing intimacy. Margaret sat near Pilar, the papers of the case stacked like a small city between them. Jasmine arrived later than expected, the pendant hidden now beneath the collar of a plain blouse. She did not speak much. When she did, her voice carried the calm that had become her public trademark, an evenness that made everything she said seem inevitable. Pilar rose to present the ledger. She had rehearsed the sequence so many times that each detail felt measured by muscle memory. Where the ledger would be placed on the table, how to describe the entries without assuming motive, how to keep the judge focused on proof rather than sympathy. The ledger itself lay open on the evidence table, a neat, guarded thing, handwritten columns of dates and amounts, the looped scrawl of someone who had kept accounts for a long time. It shows transfers, Pilar said, from the county account that should have gone to facility maintenance and foster care support. The ledger lists, side by side, payments described as operational and notes indicating they were redirected to a trust named Whitcomb. A rustle went through the courtroom. The name Whitcomb had been nothing more than a rumor in the earliest days of the investigation, a whisper that kept recurring where paper trails should have ended. Now it sat on the table like an accusation. The defense counsel, a man whose confidence was made from a different sort of contact with power, moved to strike the book on grounds of foundation. He spoke in the slow cadence of an advocate who believed in the power of delay. The ledger could be altered, he suggested. Handwriting could be forged. Motives could not be presumed. Pilar answered with the quiet precision of a prosecutor who had spent nights aligning fragments into a coherent shape. "We will lay a foundation," she said. "We have witness testimony that ties these entries to a long pattern of redirection. And we have other documents, bank statements, transfer orders, a letter." The courtroom held its breath. That was the one Pilar had not yet released publicly. The letter found in the archive box that morning. Its edges were browned, the ink was faint in places, the paper smelled faintly of attic summers. Pilar walked to the table and opened it, handing the copy to the bailiff who passed it to the judge. "May this be entered as part of the record?" she asked. The defense objected, of course. Procedural battles played out like chess. Objections and counter-objections, the judge asking that certain pages be shown to the defense under protective order, assurances made about the confidentiality of some names. But when the judge read the first lines aloud, "Miss Whitcomb, I have followed his instructions despite misgivings," the tempo of the room shifted. It was not just a ledger, it was a voice. The letter was written by the accountant who had kept the ledger. It was addressed to Whitcomb, and it named Simon Hale by the kind of specificity that leaves little room for plausible deniability. Dates, amounts, accounts. It described meetings at a cafe, conversations about ensuring family security, the purchase of silence through arrangements with staff, and a methodical reclassification of county funds. Simon, the man in the cheap suit, the same man who had watched Margaret on the courthouse steps weeks before, sat very still. His jaw tightened. For a moment his eyes found Margaret's, and there was a flicker of the long-ago promise she had once accepted and which he had allowed to evaporate. "Your Honor," the defense began, fanning through legal arguments about hearsay and the chain of custody. "This is exculpatory only when properly authenticated." "Authentication will be addressed," Pilar cut in, not loudly but with the sort of firm respect that compels attention. "We have the accountant's handwriting samples. Bank documentation matches the entries. We have testimony from a nurse who has come forward." She paused and turned her head slightly toward the witness stand. "And we have a witness who will speak under oath to meetings in which Mr. Hale was present." Robert's name hovered in the air like a shadow. He had given statements earlier, some of which had already been introduced, and his credibility was a fragile thing. Under cross-examination, he had walked the edge of confession and self-preservation. Pilar had expected the defense to use every tool to undermine him. When Robert took the stand, he was a pale man whose features seemed to have been carved by worry. Under Pilar's questioning, his voice was small but steady at first. He admitted to seeing the transfers, to writing certain memos, to avoiding certain conversations. Under the defense's cross-examination, the old habit of protection reasserted itself. He hedged, he recalled poorly, he contradicted his earlier accounts in ways that defense counsel hoped would unmake him. But then Pilar produced the ledger's pagination and the letter, and the texture of the narrative changed. With the letter's dates pinned like arrows, Robert could not maintain the careful forgetfulness. He flinched, stumbled, and then, in a moment that felt like the bending of light, he told a truth that had been ready to break free. "There were meetings," he said, voice thin. "Mr. Hale, he told me to mark certain expenditures differently. He told me to write operational instead of donations. He said people wouldn't look. I thought I was protecting the facility." His hands, torn by nervousness, found the edge of the witness stand. "I didn't think." He stopped, then started again, the honesty arriving messy and late. "I didn't think they were children. I thought it was family matters." The defense counsel objected to leading questions. The judge allowed some of the testimony. In the public gallery, someone gasped when Robert's words landed. "I didn't think they were children." The simplicity of that confession was a new kind of cruelty. Outside, beyond the marble steps, the man in the cheap suit had not yet left. Now he stood at the back of the courtroom as the proceedings continued, a presence that drew the eyes of clerks and reporters alike. When Pilar's questioning led to the name Whitcomb, his shoulders slackened as though a rope had been cut. It was then, in a narrow corridor lined with framed degrees and photos of judges' predecessors, that the woman in a coat of dusty blue arrived. She was smaller than the photograph suggested, and wore her hair like a curtain of white silk. She carried herself with that peculiar combined force of wealth and habit, someone accustomed to making decisions that bent the world to convenience. Helena Whitcomb asked to speak to the judge, and was escorted inside. Her arrival changed the color of the day. Cameras that had kept a respectful distance edged forward. Reporters whispered that Whitcomb had been known to donate to every major charity in the county, that when she chose a cause, it bloomed, and that she had never before been connected to scandal. She sat for a long time with her hands folded. Her voice, when she addressed the court, did not tremble. "I received a letter this morning," she said plainly, "signed by a man I trusted to manage some of my affairs. He told me of payments to my trust. I want those payments, every one, accounted for. If misused, they must be returned or redirected to serve children properly." There was an intake of breath. She was not a defense witness. She was, by virtue of her position, a lever. Margaret watched Helena through the slats of her fingers. She had never wished for any trivialism, no petty revenge, but she had longed for the ledger to be more than a sheet of paper that could be argued in courtrooms. Helena's presence made restitution something more than numbers. It suggested a possibility, someone, with the means, believing, however belatedly, that money could be used to fix some of what had been broken. The judge, a weary man who had seen too many of these moral summers end in cold technicalities, looked between Pilar and the defense, then toward Helena. "We need to establish the relationship of those funds to Miss Whitcomb's trust," he said. "Discovery will proceed on an expedited basis. Miss Whitcomb, if you are willing to make your records available, the court will consider protective orders. This matter will return at a date to be set." The hearing adjourned with neither triumph nor finality. There were victories that day, and there were concessions. A few witnesses wept in the hallway. Other attendees hugged with a brittle relief. Cameras followed Jasmine as she exited and stopped her with a question about how she felt. She lifted her chin and spoke, a sentence that landed in headphones and spreads across feeds. "This is not about me. It's about making sure it never happens again." Later, in the privacy of a small room in the courthouse basement where the light was dim and the coffee tasted of municipal intent, Margaret met Helena. They sat across from one another as if negotiating at a kitchen table where both knew the strength of what had been lost. "I didn't know," Helena said, not as an excuse but as an elemental confession. Her hands were small and precise. "I trusted people. I gave to the trust because I believed it would help. If those funds were used to buy silence or to mislabel transactions, then I want to set it right." Margaret's voice was not legalese. It was a calmer, rougher thing. "We don't just want money," she said. "We want oversight. We want change. We want a fund that supports foster parents, that audits placements, that pays for independent caseworkers. Money without structure gets absorbed. You know that." Helena's eyes widened as if she'd been handed a map that omitted the most important roads. "Then tell me how," she said. "I can write checks, but I will not write them into a hole. I will set up a board. I will require audits. I will give until it's embarrassing." Margaret allowed herself a small, nearly secret laugh. "Good. Then give until it's embarrassing," she said. "But sign a clause. No one with ties to the county placement office can sit on the board. And fund an independent investigator for 5 years." They drew up a plan in rough strokes there, the kind of thing that would later be enforced by lawyers and accountants, but the mood was not transactional. It had the tenor of two women recognizing the difference between compensation and repair. Margaret felt something loosen inside her, not forgiveness exactly, more the end of its sharpening. Outside, Jasmine stood on the courthouse steps, the pendant warmed by the sun as she turned it between her fingers. Reporters clustered, asking about restitution, about how she felt, about what she hoped the future would hold. She thought of the children who still shuffled through corridors of care, and of the woman whose face she had seen every morning in the pendant. For all the legal maneuvering yet to come, for all the witnesses who might fold, and for all the pages still missing, there was a new possibility: public attention redirected into structural change. A granddaughter, the one previously identified in the ledger's margins, had agreed to cooperate. Her discovery had been the hinge of the week. She had been located in a suburb that wanted privacy. There would be difficult questions for her, about memory and identity, about what it means to be visible in a trial where her childhood might be examined as evidence. But she had, in private conversations, said she wanted the truth to surface. Margaret and Jasmine arranged to meet her, to offer what they could: empathy, presence, a legal path. They did not promise that the arc of exposure would heal everything. They promised to be accountable. In doing so, they altered the shape of the case from a ledger's list into human stories that could not be easily condensed into dollar signs. As dusk thinned the city, the legal calendar filled with dates. Depositions were scheduled, the defense filed motions, subpoenas started moving like precise, cold instruments. Yet outside the noise of procedure, a different thing began. Community meetings, where foster parents came forward with accounts of paperwork misplaced, children moved without explanation, and counselors who had been ignored. The ledger had loosened something in the social grain. People who had been privately troubled found it possible now to speak publicly. That night, in her small apartment, Jasmine wrote a short list. Not demands, not even plans, just things she wanted to remember. The pendant lay on the page beside the pen, its glass catching the lamplight like a small coin. She wrote the names of children she knew, the dates of their placements, and a single line: "Make it harder to be invisible." She underlined it twice. Margaret sat with the documents on her dining table long after the sun had gone. She read the account of a nurse's confession again, and then the ledger entries. There was an economy to ledger lines, a brutal efficiency that disguised the lives beneath. She had entered public life to make right what had been broken. She had thought at times that the law might be a blunt instrument for that purpose, that its motions were cold and its timescales long. But in the small, lit room, with the plan drafted with Helena's signature as a possibility rather than a certainty, Margaret felt a different sort of work begin to take shape. The slow, granular, human labor of refusing to let the ledger be merely a list. They would go to court again. There would be days that unspooled into argument and days when the press turned personal. There would be betrayals and brave turns and discoveries still waiting in attics and old bank accounts. But that night, as the city lights flickered and the pendant cooled against Jasmine's palm, there was a sense that the ledger, so neat and terrible on an evidence table, might at last be transformed into something reparative. It could be used not only to indict, but to fund a scaffolding that would catch children differently. The work would be long. It would not erase what had been taken, but it would, perhaps, make it harder for indifference to be mistaken for oversight. And so they moved forward, through depositions and over coffee tables, through press rooms and private rooms, with the ledger, with the letter, with the pendant, and with a fragile agreement that money must be married to accountability if the future were to look different. They were not naive. They were not certain. They were, as always, persistent. Outside the courthouse, under a sky that had finally decided to clear, Jasmine lifted her face toward the light. The pendant warmed against her skin, and for the first time since she had found it, she did not feel only the weight of memory. She felt, faint and almost imperceptible, the slight lift of possibility.